Thank you for being part of the third quarter College of Arts and Science Colloquium of the 2020 Colloquia series. And this Q3 is entitled Multigenerational Diversity in Higher Education, Addressing Challenges and Opportunity. I'd like to welcome our presenter, Dr. Yvonne Lozano, who is the department chair for the health sciences in the College of Arts and Science at Ashford University, with over 18 years of experience in the field of gerontology, with a focus on geriatric mental health, long-term care administration, and caregiving education. Dr. Lozano has over 12 years of teaching gerontology, healthcare administration, sociology, applied behavioral sciences, and health and human services. Her research interests include domestic violence issues in older women, caregiver burden, end-of-life care, and Hispanic caregiver and family issues. She serves as a member of the Gerontology Society of America, American Society of Aging, American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, National Association of Social Workers, American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, and Sigma Phi Omega. Dr. Lozano is also very active in the community and has served on a board of directors for Bexar Area Agency on Aging, Christian Senior Services, Long-Term Care Coalition, Not Forgetting Coalition, and currently as a member of the Task Force Against Elder Domestic Violence and board member for STAR Chapter of Alzheimer's Association, with a recent appointment as Alzheimer's Ambassador for San Antonio. So amazing credentials. Dr. Lozano today will present on multi-generational diversity in higher education, addressing challenges and opportunities. Dr. Lozano notes that multi-generational diversity is an undeniable occurrence that must not be ignored. This presentation will provide an open and holistic approach to acknowledging the differences and similarities that individuals bring to the classroom or to the workplace. You may post questions in the chat, and we will use them to facilitate a question and answer session with Dr. Lozano at the end of her presentation. Also, please keep an eye on the chat toward the end of the presentation for a link to an important follow-up survey, as we appreciate your feedback. And now, Dr. Yvonne Lozano.
Thank you for that, Paul, and hello everybody, and good morning to some, maybe almost afternoon for others. Really happy to be here today. Kind of a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Anything related to aging, people always ask, what is gerontology? What does a gerontologist do? Why did you study aging? Why did you go into this field? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that, but gerontology is the study of aging. And we all start aging at the moment of birth. Obviously, I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I don't need to show a lot of academic support, I guess, to solidify that response. But we start from the moment that we're born until we don't. But one of my favorite sayings, and this is of course, when you hear all of my background, you think, oh, we're just going to talk about baby boomers today or traditionalists in the generations, but we're not. I think it's important to recognize the diversity that we often talk about related to race, related to gender, diversity related to the LGBT community. We are always having those discussions, but many times we don't have the discussion of how diverse our generations are. Not necessarily from a perspective, like I mentioned, with gender or race, but from a perspective of the generation in which that person was raised, in which they grew up, that generation, and the impact that it has on someone as they become students, as they grow up in life, as they move toward transitions that they experience into their life, as someone moves into getting into a college per se, or getting into the workforce, even getting married. But this is Satchel Paige. This is a quote that I've used probably for as long as I can remember, since I got into the field. How old would you be if you didn't know how old you are? And I use this a lot with my students to really help them to begin to envision that feeling and that sense that they have of how old they are. The chronological age kind of adds kind of almost expected behaviors for certain ages as we move forward and as we move along in life. And as I started to prepare for this presentation, I really just decided these were the groups that you see here: the millennials, the boomers, the Gen X, and the Gen Z generation that we're going to talk about, because it's the groups and the generations that are more closely related to the age groups that we see in the workforce, in university settings, even those of you who are probably with your own adult children or young children, you kind of start to see these generations. And I often, for data, you're not going to find a lot of information from magazines you can find in regards to reading, but in looking for the academic support in the presentation that I did today, I didn't really find a lot of what I wanted to talk about particularly. But what I did find that I appreciated was the work that the Pew Center is doing with generations from a multi-generational standpoint. Because it looked at not only the workforce, but it looks at, voting, how these different generations are voting. And for a long time, we understood for example, that the boomers were the not only the largest generation, but they were also a very actively and a significant part of voting. And so as you move forward away from that, you start to find out that the millennials are now a big part of the voting force. And so the Pew Center kind of makes these distinctions, particularly kind of describing, as you see here, cutoff points aren't an exact science. There is just a tool. So you can't say, well, if you were born after 1990, then you wouldn't fall into that generation. You fall into the other. But it really has to do more with the span, because there's really nothing that's really solidified or that anyone can agree on as to what that span should be. And that is something that I also agree with, that the Pew Center mentioned. The Pew Center, kind of just to give you kind of a general look at what this is. For the silent generation, we're not going to be talking about that generation much today, but the silent generation, the baby boomers born between 46 and 1964, Generation X born between 1965 to 1980, and the millennials born between 1981 and 1996. And we'll also be including another generation here as we move forward. But if you start to take a closer look at this, and you start to think about whether yourself or your parents or your grandparents and when they were born and kind of their experiences and how they've evolved, this is where the diversity starts to occur. In gerontology, and sometimes also in psychology, we look at the life course perspective. What was occurring during this generation, and what is the life course perspectives that were developed by each of these individuals as they grew up. We know now the life course perspective for those who grew up in this generation of COVID and the pandemic will have a lot to talk about. We'll have different experiences. Even the struggle of some of the youth, those that are 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are having to move back home for whatever reasons because of the impact of COVID on them financially, and maybe just overall protection. So there's an impact in this generation that will have a significant change of heart for them regarding a lot of issues, such as maybe even voting, maybe how they raise their family, maybe how they decide to buy houses or rent homes, whatever that situation might be. And also their experiences in the workplace as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm trying to bring about some of those examples to just provide some clarity as to how we start to see this diversity and how this can create challenges and opportunities as well. So the Gen Zers are more likely to be enrolled in college. You know, you kind of look at this, it kind of gives you an idea of how this has progressed. If you look at the Gen Xers who were in 1987, we saw 43%. And it moves up to 52% for millennials in 2003, and the Gen Zers are obviously 57% of them are enrolled in college. And these are the percentage of students that had 7 to 17-year-olds living with a parent who has at least a bachelor's degree. And as you can see, this starts to increase. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, you having to get in the workforce early in your life as boomers because of the economy, what may particularly have been their expectations from their parents, from the boomers who were parents of silent generation parents, and what was going on in their life during that time, both economically, what be going so far as marriage was concerned. There are so many factors that begin to impact that decision-making process for individuals as they move into transition into things like college and marriage and those type of major decisions in their life, purchasing a home. All of this plays a role. And what people don't recognize is the importance of this data and this information in how we begin to think about our infrastructure, how we begin to think about how voting is going to change. All of those things kind of play a part. And as those of you who already know me can know that voting is on the top of my head right now. So I'm using that a lot, which I'm surprising myself that that's coming out. But nonetheless, I will move forward here. Excuse me. To be more specific, let's talk about the Gen X generation, born between 1965 and 1980. They're described as flexible, adaptive, techno-literate, and information. Now, when you start to think about some of these things in higher education, and you start to think about someone that was born between this time, we don't, of course, ever want to place these labels on someone in which then this is what we're expecting from them. But I already hear things when I'm and even at Ashford, sometimes I'll hear people say, you know, well, sometimes, you know, some of the older students or even older faculty really have difficult time with some of the being techno-literate. The ageist view, the assumption is already there that this is an issue because of that person's age. And so, in fact, this kind of assumption, just like all other kinds of assumptions, or presumptions, can create this whole sense of beginning to separate those generations one from the other. And the other thing can be turned around too. I mean, I hear, you know, and just a personal experience, someone say, well, gosh, that young person talks so fast. I don't know how anyone can understand them. I recall a funny story with me when I went not long ago, a few months back, I was going through a drive-through to get in Texas, you can tell I went to get some tea. So anybody who's lived in Texas know how important it is to go get some nice cold tea at the drive-thru. So I went to go get some iced tea, and the charge for the tea was, I think it was $2.75. I'll just kind of try to remember like that. Well, I didn't have anything but a 20, but I gave the person who was working at the $20.75. Well, that just threw her beyond anything. For one thing, she actually had to get her manager to help her how to figure that out. But those of you who are probably just thinking about that have probably had some of those experiences. Well, it's not just because she's young, it's the generation in which she grew up. It didn't have anything to do with that per se. A generation in which they're used to ATM cards, they're used to using cards, used to Venmo, used to Zelle, used to all of those cash apps, whatever it might be. They're used to using all those different features. And so for some, they're not spending a lot of time figuring out change. And so I just wanted to kind of bring that as example about. So we don't want to use what I'm presenting, but this is what research is showing kind of some of the more commonalities that we see with this generation. So those of you who fall into this generation can say, yeah, some of that's me and some of that's not. But it does, however, give us some kind of baseline to understand the diversity and differences. I'm trying to stay on target here with time, so let me move on. Also with the Gen Xers, they have flexible, as employees, they're looking for what employers offer: flexible schedules, performance-based compensation, flexible locations. You can read them all here. credit for results achieved. So as an employer, or even as you think about the students, you can think about what students may be looking for that fall into this category. And I'm not asking you to go and look at everyone's age to kind of see, but you can kind of start to get an idea. A clear area or responsibilities, a chance for creative expression. All of this can be used in the classroom and can be used to kind of create the curriculum. You start to kind of think about that. But you don't want to just create curriculum for one generation. And sometimes I think that's the issue, is when you're creating the curriculum and bringing forth some of the technological tools that come about for that person or those persons, and sometimes it begins to limit others, or sometimes it creates challenges for others, or sometimes it just can create very strong opportunities in that kind of level of familiarity. Ageism is a term that we, obviously it's a form of, can be a form of discrimination against older adults. But, I often tell my students that ageism really is not just saying negative things about older people. It's about saying negative things about anyone of any age. Oh, that young person, or they're just younger and they don't know what they're doing. And so that is a form of that too. We kind of set that criteria on that person based on just how old they are. Or we think we know how old they are. But these are kind of some of the comments that I have found, throughout and looking at some of the researches here. Gen Xers tend to have the most conflict with baby boomers. Now, part of that may be is that some of those Gen Xers were actually, right after the baby boom population or generation started to come about. There's a million reasons why that should be. They see them as slow and in the way and unproductive. And this is what we see, this kind of diversity, this kind of ageist views also is something that we see often in the workplace as well. It's kind of that assumption that that's what's going on. Often with my nieces and nephews, they'll send me something, and they'll send me something to do that's technological, and they'll say, do you need me to help you with that? I'm like, no, I don't need you to help me with that. I mean, but if I did need you to help me with it, but their assumption is right away that I'm probably going to need help with it. And so, that plays a role in it as well. It's frustrating with them, but they don't believe in calling or using the phone, calling at all. So everything has to be on text. And they have all these rules, but they're all fall along that, they're millennials. Generation Y, these are the children of baby boomers born between 1981 and 2000. So it's important to recognize that these are children of baby boomers. So as each generation moves forward, it starts to evolve. They are a distinctive generation. They're often called millennials. This is Generation Y. And baby boomers too. Of course, that makes sense why that would happen. They're on fast forward. They have a lot of similarities to Generation X, but they are definitely on fast forward. They're very obviously techno savvy and very independent. In addition to that, they've had great exposure to what is called adult activities than any previous generation before. And I think we all know how that exposure even begins to happen. And even more experimentation. I have a missing letter there. They've had a lot of informational activity, a lot of that based on just what they're getting on social media. The assumption is they're the most informed generation to have lived on the planet. Not necessarily information that's that helpful, but we could say that too, but it's general thought. They're a distinctive generation, I think I've already got that on there, but they're described as ambitious, precocious, stressed, indifferent, wayward, they're techno nerds, and politically conservative. As you start to kind of see some of these identifying factors, you can start to see why, when you, even from a marketing perspective of what to sell and what to do in selling products, selling expectations of what's necessary, let's say, even in looking at not only just from an educational standpoint, but also from a work standpoint and how to manage and work with these individuals. Now, again, you look at these and you think, well, God, these are just labels and everybody's different. Yes, everyone's an individual. Everybody's very different. But when you look at the whole generation, these are just some starting points. And that's what I like to tell people. These are starting points. Millennials have often led older Americans in their adoption. They've always been ahead of older Americans as far as technology is concerned. And this is primarily still true today. However, since 2012, among older generations, which is considered to be the Gen Xers and the baby boomers, there's been significant growth in tech adoption. And anybody who's turned 50 and gets an AARP magazine will see and often find that there's always a lot of AARP offerings in regards to, technology. So there's been a big push toward that for these older populations, and also those in the older generations that are still working, that recognizing the importance of technology in their place of employment. So it's often seen as a challenge just because the person being older. So the expectation is that they can't learn, which in fact, that is false. So I just kind of put this as a nice quote that I liked from the Pew Center. More than 9 in 10 millennials own smartphones compared to 90% of Gen Xers. So it kind of goes on. 68% of baby boomers between the ages of 55 and 73. And of course, the silent generation. And for silent generation, 74 to 91, it's 40%. I'm really happy about that. As a gerontologist, I'm very happy about that. Right? Really happy to see that they're moving forward with that. I talked to a friend of mine who's a geriatrician. She's a physician specializing in the care of older adults. And I've asked her during COVID, I said, are you getting a lot of people between these ages of 70 and on up using the telehealth? And she said, oh, absolutely. She said, it's not a problem for them. They use their phones. That's how they're meeting with their doctors. And I was really pleased to see that was happening. Just another plus there for geriatric population. And the baby boomers born between 1946 and 64, educated, independent, optimistic. When you look at the baby boomers compared to traditionalists, we began to kind of see how this particular group really became more educated, became very strong working force. It was also a very large generation too, as so far as numbers was concerned. A lot of them grew up in big families, so they have a strong understanding of teamwork. They like rewards, particularly looking for money, titles, and recognition. So again, something to consider in looking at the diversity of those generations, primarily following the lead from their parents or how they were raised, but then also following what may have been occurring in that particular generation during that time, even historically, what may have been occurring. Willing to go the extra mile, baby boomers continued optimistic, positive, idealistic, very driven. I had my oldest student at Ashford in one of my gerontology program was 83 years old. She of course falls in that traditionalist category. I still tell people that she was probably the best student I've ever had still at Ashford. And there was so much of that. She was even a kind of a mixture of what the baby boomer had in traditionalist, but she was very much committed and passionate. And I asked her, I said, why did you come back to school? What made you decide to come back to school after you'd been retired for almost 20 years? She said, I was sitting at home and I was thinking, I want to learn something new. And she said, well, I'm old, so I might as well learn some stuff about myself. And I looked it up and I found Ashford, and here I am. And so I really loved her explanation of why she was there. But I can tell you, she didn't require a lot of management in the classroom. She was learning a lot on her own. She took a lot of initiatives. And so I found myself being somewhat ageist with her at the beginning, thinking, oh, I'm going to really need to help her through some of the technology. But she graduated with 4.0. She was an amazing student. Kind of looking at business needs when you start to think about boomers as well. They are going to have to adapt to working with younger dynamic force. And a lot of this has to do with kind of the own boomers' own ageist views of younger forces. Managers who are younger than they are, but also be aware of what these generation characteristics are. Now remember, this isn't necessarily a characteristic of an individual, but looking at characteristics of the whole generation. Managers also recognizing that to support an aging workforce and their desire to continue to achieve success and do everything that it can be done in the classroom and with colleagues and in the workforce to try to minimize the conflict and pitfalls with younger generations. These are the baby boomers. A lot of boomers not planning to retire anytime soon and continuing to stay in the workforce. Look at the Gen Zers. We have about 4 minutes here. People born between 1995 to 2010. These are true digital natives, and I love the way this is stated by the researchers here. They've been exposed to the internet, to social networks, to mobile systems. This is really what they know and all they know. They're hypercognitive, very comfortable with collecting and cross-referencing many sources. So they're used to being on the digital world. And so when you start to think about this generation moving into university, moving to the college, and addressing with some of those challenges, you can start to look at some of these characteristics and already start to see what some of the challenges may be and what some of the opportunities are in working with this particular generation. They believe in the importance of dialogue and opinion. Another characteristics here. Unfortunately, now they're in an uncertain future because of what's happening with COVID. But they're eligible voters who range between 18 and 23. They're more a racially and ethnic diverse population. I read somewhere last week where this generation has the highest number of Hispanics in this particular generation than any of the other generations I identified. Their majority are non-Hispanic white, and notable 22% are Hispanic, according to the Pew Research Center, and so also the Census Bureau data. So this will also play a significant role in many different aspects from work and from marketing and from education as well. To kind of close up here, and we must practice tolerance, and we must learn to listen and accept these differences. So when in wrapping this up, and this is a very difficult presentation to do in 30 minutes, so you can't do it without trying to understand these generations and the characteristics that are developed from each of those generations. You can even think of the generation, the age group of individuals who were growing up during 9/11, growing up or went to war. You start to think of those historical factors that impact someone's life course perspective and how they were raised, the generation that they were raised by, the generation they were raised from, and some of the values and the expectations that came along with that. All of that, as individuals, we bring that to the table as employees, as academicians, as staff. We bring it to the table as students. Our students bring some of these to the table as well. I had a student the other day that said, can I get a PowerPoint presentation for each chapter? This was a few months ago. And I asked him why he wanted that. And he said, I really don't have time to read the book. I learn better by reading just some quick information. And I, of course, later on, took a close look to see what generation he was from, and it made perfect sense. He fit right in there. I wonder if anybody can kind of guess what generation that student may have been from. So we can talk about that in a bit. But I've got 1 minute, so I'll start closing up here and open the floor for questions. Paul, if that's okay with you.
Sounds good. There is a question from Lance, Millennial ?
Okay.
And let's see here. I'm going to allow people to unmute themselves too. If you want to just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask Dr. Lozano a question. Oh, I see. Lance guessed which generation wanted the PowerPoint.
That's right.
Millennial.
Lance is right. Lance wins the prize.
There we go. Catherine.
Lozano, this is Haley Pessner. I have a question for you. I was thinking about the statistics regarding the smartphones, and I think it was the silent generation was at about 40 or 44% have adopted the use of using a smartphone. Is that correct? Am I remembering that correctly? And then I was sort of comparing that to your response to your, I think it was your niece or your nephew, who always seemed to want to help you with technology. And I'm wondering if the silent generation is open to, those offers of help with their smartphones, or if they really, maybe there's other characteristics of that generation that mean they prefer to figure it out on their own, or I was just curious about that.
Well, the studies that I read on technology and aging, and looking particularly at the old, what they call the older adult, in that year, that span that's discussed for traditionalists, the traditionalists are more open to this help than the boomers are. Not by much in percentage. I'd have to look at that data to kind of look at that. Boomers are just driven and wanting to kind of figure it out on their own. And it's kind of like asking for directions. Those of you who are old enough to remember what a map is, asking directions or looking for a map. Not everybody knows what a map is anymore, or even has looked at one. Maybe they might know, but they haven't looked at one. So the silent generation is very much very excited to traditionalists and being able to use what studies show, the phones or technology, and a way to connect. And that also, one thing that study said that I'm thinking about, also refer to the fact that they're connecting better with family members, like younger family members, who would not necessarily maybe not able to get there to visit with them, but now they're able to connect with them through technology, whether it's a Zoom meeting or whether it's FaceTime. So this has been part of their interest in doing so.
Sure. I recently met a gentleman who's part of the silent generation. He was a fisherman for 39 years. He was captain of a large fishing boat. And he loves the smartphone, and he is all about the emojis. And he calls them memes. Instead of a meme, he calls them mimi. Which I thought was adorable, but he sends pictures and he adds people's pictures to his contacts so he knows who's calling him, and I thought that was pretty neat.
Yeah, and I think a part of it, when you're looking at diversity, a lot of times, like I said, we look at diversity in regards to race and gender, etc. But there is a lot of diversity to be considered and recognized within the generation as well. The differences based on those particular generations. And so it's important to recognize what those differences are so that we can either support, lend a handout support, even suggest it, but not make assumptions it's not even possible, especially in consideration for so many of our students.
I do have a question. So as an instructor, and we have many instructors still on the line here with us, would you recommend us having kind of a cheat sheet with each of the generations, how they think as we're interacting with them in the discussions in our classrooms, so that we can kind of interact with them correctly?
Well, not that we'll do it correctly, but that we'll have an awareness that there's a difference. You can't make that assumption, based on how a person looks, like,
sure.
Decide how old they are, or make the assumption based on, a lot of times, a lot of the older students in their 70s and 80s will say, I'm 73 years old, I'm 85 years old, because they want to brag about that. They want to tell, like, hey, I'm in here with all these young kids, kind of thing. And usually they're very receptive and kind of open, but they're proud that they're there, they're very proud, and and so. But I have to tell you, I cheat a lot with the changes. I spend a lot my teaching for at least the last 12 years. A lot of it has been based on kind of some of those generational traits. And someone said, that's right, those traits are not set in stone, and you can't just make that be your only way of looking at those students. But also when you're looking at curriculum, you might want to remember to kind of keep some of that information in mind, especially when thinking about technology. So you're right.
Well, yeah, like even, I'm a baby boomer. I like rewards. So, if I know I have a baby boomer in there, then, giving them a kudo, attaboy, helps motivate them to continue to do really good work in the class.
Yeah. And even for that matter, you have to think about, I've been kind of watching this discussion that started nationwide about giving this trophy to everybody. And there was some talk about it in the news this morning too. And I think there's the generation of getting a trophy. Someone was saying that they even give like ribbons for 17th place and those kind of things.
Yeah.
It's a very
participation. Yeah.
So, you either got, in my generation, you either got first, second, third place, and nobody else got anything after that. So I think just for developmentally, there's a lot of reasoning behind that as to why we do that with children, and to try to make them feel, or even young adolescents and teenagers. However, it's really creating this whole sense of entitlement for this particular group of generation they were talking about. And again, it's just a guide. That's all it is. It's not like, with your baby boomers, so these are the only things that you experience.
Right.
We're all different. So we don't want to tie ourselves down to these beliefs and these identifying factors and just decide this is the only way that it is. So
yeah. Keep that in mind. Yeah. Any other questions? Again, you can unmute yourself in the Zoom room and ask a question. All right. I think we may come to the end here. So let me just say thank you, Dr. Lozano, for a very timely presentation, and to everyone attending the September colloquium. Please complete the survey, the follow-up survey, which has been posted in the chat. The survey will also be available with the recording of this presentation on the AU, CETL, and also the YouTube channel. And it'll be emailed directly to you as well and found on the CETL website. Stay tuned though, don't go away. Stay tuned to your email inboxes, the CETL website, and the CETL social media for details about the next CAS colloquium on October 5th, presented by Dr. Nancy DeVore, an associate faculty member for Ashford University, on the subject of using neuroscience to improve online learning in a mediated world. So that should be really interesting. A lot of great topics coming up. We actually, for Q4, we have 4 presentations in this colloquium series. So anyway, again, Dr. Lozano, thank you so much for your presentation and for enlightening us on the different generations and how we can really, work with them in our classrooms and personally as we interact.
Thank you very much. You guys have a great day. Stay safe out there.